I have access.
Great. Thanks for having me, guys. My name's Aaron Kogan. I am been a software access developer for about, 21 years now. Also been working with SQL Server for the past, I don't even know, call it about 10 years, a little longer than that. And yeah, used to be a member of the DAAUG, was communications director, whatever that position is called that I think Dawn has right now. And it's good to be back. So thank you guys for having me. I also work part-time for Spacely Sprockets. I was asked to come up with a name and an image, and well, this is what we ended up with. So hopefully we'll find some more bad puns along the way. So the agenda, why use stored procedures? We'll talk a little bit about that. We're going to create a stored procedure together. Again, my intention here is not to spend a lot of time talking about stored procedures per se, but spending more time talking about calling them from Access. But I feel like there's enough space here that we can dig into other pieces and go other directions if once we get through the meat of what I was planning on sharing. So, and feel free to ask questions along the way. So I use stored procedures, performance. Basically, using a stored procedure means that the code has been moved over to the server, where there's generally going to be more RAM, more CPU, etc. So when you run that those queries over there and all this code over there, you're having it do all the heavy lifting and then passing that on to the client's computer, and that just gives better performance, makes life a little simpler. Similarly, minimize network traffic. So again, asking SQL Server to do all the processing, you're generally going to get a smaller amount of data, less results coming back, instead of where with certain types of queries, and I know it's gotten better over the years, when you write that query in Access, sometimes what you're going to get is sending the request over to SQL Server. Depending on how that query was written, SQL Server may go, I don't know how to optimize this, so it's going to send back the whole data set and then let the client computer in Access process all that. So that's also the performance hit, but also sending more stuff over the wire that's unnecessary. But yeah, I know that that's gotten better over the years, but there's still some places where that's not as clean. And the big one, I think, is cached execution plans. We're not going to get into those today because it's a little beyond the scope, but in short, if you're not familiar, when SQL Server executes a stored procedure, or for that matter, any stored code, the first time it does it, or anytime it's changed and you've resaved it, SQL Server Engine is going to actually figure out the best way to execute it. And then when it remembers how it did, when it figures it out, it's actually going to save that, cache it as it were. And then next time you execute it, it's actually going to run, generally speaking, notably faster. And it'll do that as long as it saves that cache. And there's a whole world around that we're not going to get into. So, but that's pretty awesome. Security and permissions as well, another good reason to use stored procedures. It's more centralized. It's also a much better security model than Access. So you can get very granular down to tables, and the tables that are used in the stored procedure, or the stored procedure itself, is along regarding security and all that. Easier to maintain. This, I don't know, this probably could be an argument on some levels, but I actually prefer, generally speaking, to have that code and stored procedure. I do find it easier to maintain, a little easier to run with. And one of the cool advantages is if I have, let's say, a stored procedure that's running and I need to make some changes to it, and those changes don't affect the structure or the schema that it's returning. So in other words, let's just say it's a query that it's returning a row set, and those rows, the columns are not going to change if I make the change to the stored procedure. For example, let's say I'm just changing the sort order, or maybe adding a little bit of another where clause criteria to it. Well, since the structure is the same, the front end's expecting the same structure, I can make that change And in real time, the users might actually see that fix without having to roll out a whole front end. Again, that's not always the case, but sometimes in certain scenarios where it feels safe to do that on a production server, I can do that, which is cool. And I'm going to throw it out to anyone. Anyone else have any other good reasons to use stored procedures?
I think the SSMA is better than the work with access and that so far.
Yep, agreed.
I think too, you know, with your point about easier to maintain, a lot of times if you have to make a change that only affects the procedure and not its output, you can speed up changes to your production environment. You don't have to go through, you know, whatever you have to go through to deploy a new front end version.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, there's a certain modularity. You can kind of create certain sets of functionality in a stored procedure, then reuse that, even combine it with another procedure elsewhere in your application, which is nice.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to cons. Why not use stored procedures? Well, I mean, I don't know how valid this is. I put the possible in there because I felt like I needed to qualify it. Yes, there's a learning curve. I don't think it's particularly steep. I think it's a little daunting. And honestly, one of the biggest learning curves for me, which sounds ridiculous looking back on it, is, you know, coming from a different learning to access, it's like you just hit save when you're done making changes. With a stored procedure, you have to execute the alter script. It's not that it's difficult, it just seemed very unintuitive the first time. Other than that, you know, the learning curve, there is some learning curve in there depending on how fancy you get with your code and what the challenge is, but I don't know. I guess there's always a learning curve there. And I would argue that there's a little more effort to call or consume a stored procedure from Access, for example. Once I've learned how to do it, and what I'm going to show you guys is I'm going to call it a framework that I use. I find it to be really easy, and although yes, it might take a little longer to develop than, let's say, a built-in query in Access, the payoff in the long term is you know, multifold in the payback. You know, ultimately a lot of times performance being one of the bigger ones too. So, and I'm going to put it out there too. Anyone have any other cons, any reasons you shouldn't use a stored procedure? I mean, in a particular scenario.
Well, the data sets are not updatable.
Great point. That's a really good point. That's so good, it's going in the slide.
Thanks.
Let's see if I can edit this. I cannot.
You find that, you
I
find
don't
that
understand.
Oh,
Explain, please.
I'm sorry, I heard a couple voices, but I didn't catch what anyone said.
I didn't understand Dawn's comment.
Oh, got it. I will explain it in 1 second. So it's actually a great point I completely forgot about, is that they are a read-only data set. So when you get when you run a stored procedure and get a result set, oops, hold on. There we go. The result set you get is read-only. There is no option to edit it at all. Whereas when you're working with a linked table or a view with an asterisk after that, you can actually edit the data as well as view it. So.
I had a question
I
here.
don't necessarily. Go ahead.
Do you find when you're working with a client that you have to wind up dealing with a DBA that doesn't know you? And if so, what kind of permissions do you request from him or her?
Good question. I'm trying to think of them. I have a pretty good, most of my clients I've had very long-standing relationships with, and therefore have a pretty long-standing good relationship with IT. Most of them have given me pretty high-level permissions on their SQL Server instance. or at least over the databases I maintain. And so they tend to be pretty hands-off. I'm probably pretty lucky that way. I have a feeling it's not that case for a lot of other shops. You have one client that's much more, I'd say, tighter with their screws. And in my little pocket of the world, they're pretty flexible. I mean, I know they're monitoring what I do closely, and that's fine, but they seem to be pretty trusting of it. So I feel like I've gotten pretty lucky in that area. There's probably some other folks out there that can probably speak to having to navigate that those pretty murky waters better than I can.
Yeah, permissions in SQL Server can twist your brain. One thing, if depending on the service account you might be using for access, and maybe you can explain this, Aaron, there is a need in some cases to grant execute in the stored procedure.
Right. It definitely depends on how you have the security set up around users, logins, DB roles, and all that too. To be honest, it's a great question, Don, or comment, but it's a little outside of the scope I wanted to cover today, though.
Okay.
So maybe we can touch on that later on if there's some time.
Okay.
Well, and Aaron, this is Dave. The main thing I use Access and SQL Server for is sending 700 kids to leadership camps every summer, where hundreds of Rotary Club members pay for it and thousands of applicants and that kind of stuff. But I often end up at a camp where I can't connect, and my SQL Server is on Amazon Web Services. So I have to be able to operate as an island, and then everything with SQL Server is just gone.
Right. So you're kind of in a disconnected data set. Yeah, for sure. Right on. Well, thanks for sharing that. Right on. Well, I'm kind of itching to get some code going.
Aaron,
You guys, yeah, please.
This is Tim and Eugene. I had one other point having to do both with scripting changes to procedures and also security. I like the fact that the changes to the procedures are made through scripts, because I can develop those in a development environment, run them in a test environment, and then I can save them as an audit trail of changes I've made to procedures. Or if I don't have permission to execute them, I can hand them over to the DBA, who can use them to execute if he wants in a test procedure, test database, if he feels like that's necessary. But I like the audit trail created by a scripted change to a procedure.
Yeah, that's a terrific point too. Yeah, it makes upgrades a lot easier, whether it's being done by myself or you for that matter, or handing it off to IT. Just basically everything's pretty much automated that way. Hit F5 and, well, sometimes fingers crossed, and then it's good to go. So yeah, right on. All right, thanks guys. Let's play around a little bit. Now, I want to start off by saying I am not intending to impress you guys with my stored procedure skills today. That's not the intent of what we're doing. I wanted to keep it really simple, just kind of talk more high level. So the first thing we're going to do is just create a very simple stored procedure, and then we're going to move into Access and call it, and talk about a couple ways to call it and get into there. So literally just going to create a stored procedure, right click, new stored procedure. The first thing I always do is just delete this first chunk of code, which is a bit of more of a how to use it. And I've already got a name. I'm going to pop that in right there. And I'm not going to fill this stuff out, although I usually do, but we're just trying to get something up and running here. Get rid of, we don't have any parameters for this guy. We'll leave the no count on. And here is my super fancy SQL statement. I hope you're all very impressed. And real quick, this is going to be, I'm going to format the code really fast using SQL prompt. So just doing that, you can see here if I make it really weird looking and all that, if I do that, it cleans it up real nice. I was just using the, there it is, Control Y, I just use the keyboard. So what we're doing in this particular stored procedure is I have a table, and all we're going to do is just set the date to the current date. that's it, the current date and time. And the reason I'm doing that is that when we run it, we can check the table and see that it ran. So again, it's just a means to an end more than it is meant to be impressive in my stored procedure skills. So now that we got that, I'm gonna hit F5 to actually create it. And if I come over here and refresh, we should see it show up pretty much near the top there, which we do. And we're gonna open up a Access file that I put together to kind of get us going here. So here's that my table I was talking about. This right here is yesterday. So when we execute it, we can come back over here, refresh this, and see if it's the current date and time that we know it worked. So we're going to do basically two different ways of executing a stored procedure from Access. There's the ADO way of doing it, which is the first thing we're going to do. I'm doing it mostly just to make Jim smile, because Jim had mentioned that he thought it's good to share that. And then we're going to use pass-through queries for most of the rest of it, because this is actually the way I do most of my stored procedure interactions. And I was going to say consumings. I don't know if that's English or not, but no one's going to question me. So let's just move on. That's how I consumings of my stored procedures. Okay, so we're going to start off by just hitting the button, and then we'll dig into the code a bit more. It worked. Well, how about that? So if I come over here and refresh, we should see 4:15, 2:52 p.m. So it worked. That's great. I hope you're impressed. I can hear the applause through the muted microphones. Thank you so much. Let's take a look at what's going on behind the scenes here. So this is how to use the ADO connection. First thing you're going to need is reference to the Microsoft Access ActiveX objects. I think I'm using 6.1 here. I am. And basically two variables to get us going. One's going to hold the connection itself, and one's going to actually hold the command that we send or the stored procedure. So starting off with the connection, the first thing we need to do is create a connection string. And I'm using ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server. Right here, you can see me passing in the name of my instance to SQL Server. I'm using a trusted connection, which I'm going to say this. I think I'm correct. If I'm not, someone's going to correct me. I believe means I'm using Windows integrated authentication, which is to say, it's basically verifying that my current Windows login can use SQL Server. And again, that's getting into security and permissions, which we're not going to bother with today. And then finally, the database we're using, which is AdventureWorks. So this is going to create that connection string and then pass that into the connection object itself. And then we're going to, you guessed it, open the connection. And then here's where we actually execute the stored procedure. The command itself is going to get the connection so it knows where to connect to. What we're actually doing, which is calling a stored procedure, and the text, which is the actual stored procedures name. And I believe, we're going to try it out. I believe if I throw in the schema name, it will also work. It should work, because if I had two stored procedures in two different schemas, it should be able to differentiate. So we should be at 255, which we are. Alrighty. And then coming back over here, so we just wrapped up that. Then we're just going to close our connection, and we're going to throw a almost inappropriate message to say it works. So that's how that works. What's cool about using the ADO is that, and we didn't do it here because I didn't want to spend much time on it because I'm not a big fan of ADO, is you can actually obviously pass in several parameters, but you can also get the output parameters if you use output parameters in the stored procedure as well. And you can do that all through this call right here using the command object. So I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions, comments?
Without going down a really long rabbit hole, why are you not a fan of ADO?
That's a great question. The code is clean enough. That's fine. When you see how I use the pass-through queries, I think it'll make more sense of why I prefer it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a great question. And I think more than anything, I think it's personal preference.
Ah, okay. All right, that's cool.
Yeah, it's a great question though. This feels more professional. I mean, if I'm being really honest, it just looks like more code.
Yeah, you can charge more for this.
Exactly. I was waiting for Jim to chime in on that one. Yeah. It's like, look, I know what I'm doing. There's commands and connections and executes, and yeah, for sure. So any other comments or defense of ADO before I move on to pass-through queries?
I just want-
ADO was long not valid, I think. It's now real life, but I don't know the right words for it. But it was
Yeah.
banned a long time,
Yeah.
and the driver was very long time, very old.
Yeah, that's a great point. It was, and I remember for years, if I remember correctly, is that they were threatening to kill off or deprecate ADO, and then it came back, and then there was fear of it going away, but it's still here. Great, I guess. I'm just cracking myself up. All right. Anything
No,
else on
they
ADO?
officially undepreciated it.
Yes, undeprecated. All righty, so let's move on to pass-through queries, which is, if you haven't figured it out, my preferred way of doing it. So what is a pass-through query? Thanks for asking. A pass-through query is literally just passing in T-SQL into an actual SQL Access object and having that T-SQL command be passed directly or passed through to SQL Server to execute. So you can see right here, this stored procedure, which we'll look at in a moment, is the exact same execution I would do in SQL Server. There's no difference. And that's the passing through of it. And we're going to take a quick look at what this stored procedure does, because why not? Really quick SQL prompt by just hitting F12 on my keyboard or right-clicking and going to script objects, I can go right to the stored procedure, which is way cool. Or if I do Control F12 or select it in here, it'll select it over here, which again, way cool. So this stored procedure really is pretty much doing the same thing. We're just updating that same table. The only difference is we're actually returning a row set. And even though it's an action query, if you will, or making a change, we don't really need a row set return. I actually can pass back information on how things went. Or for example, if I wanted to pass back some values that happened in my action query, I can pass that back here. Now, I'm not even talking about the fact that we can do store, we're going to get to it in a moment, but where I can actually pass back a whole row set for, let's say, a report or a form to list a bunch of rows or data. We're going to get into that in a little bit, but ultimately, even though this isn't meant to do that, I can still pass back, let's say, error codes. Did it run in SQL Server? If it ran great, I'll pass back an error number of 0. And if not, I can actually pass back the error number, the description, the line number, the procedure, all that stuff in the actual select. So I know when I get done running this stored procedure, I can actually check the pass-through queries results and actually read that out. So if I run it over here, you can see I'm getting that return. Now, granted, it worked as not much of a return as far as functional production code goes, but I could easily change that over, and I have, to do things that are more functional. So while we're at it, let's just double check that it actually works. So we're going to come over here, click that. It worked. I'm going to go to my table, and that's the current time. So now the question is, so that's really all that is. It's pretty basic, pretty straightforward. It's pretty cool, actually. It's almost like writing ad hoc queries, but you can save them out. Now, the one thing with pass-through queries that I found to be a little interesting at the beginning and then got used to was that just like a linked table, it actually has a connection string, because it has to know when it's called, how and where and what it's calling to. In other words, what database, or excuse me, what server, what database, what driver, et cetera. And that's all stored behind the scenes here, just like in a table, a linked table would be right over here. And so that has some, if you want to call it overhead or whatever around that. However, I use almost all my projects use SQL Server as a backend, and I do a lot of linking and store and pass-through queries. And so when the project opens, when the application opens, it will refresh those links. So it actually goes through the list of all the link tables, and then also the link of all the list of pass-through queries, and update if it needs to the connection string. So a more specific example is if I take I'm ready to push out an upgrade, I'll take this file, bring it up to the server, and when I put it on the server and launch it, it actually reads and checks, say, oh, I'm on a different server, I need to relink it. So then it'll use kind of store some of that information in a local table, and it goes through and reads and figures out which connection string to build, and then does it. And behind the scenes, I'm not doing it in this particular project because this project is such a pared down, simple example project, but in my production ones, I'm using a version of what Juan Soto did. I am forgetting the name of it, but he has a whole script that he offers for free, I believe, on his website that helps do those relinking. So I used that and then modified it over the years to be a little more of what I wanted. But basically that's what it does. It stores the list of all the link tables in a table in SQL Server. And then when you launch, it actually goes to that, links to that table, reads that table to get the list of tables that it needs to link, and then does the linking. So again, outside the scope of here, but wanted to just throw that in there. So I'm going to check the chat real fast and see. Jack was saying you need to use SQL replication so that you have the main server and a SQL Server local to work with. Jack, are you referring to what I'm talking about now, or am I a little out of date on that one?
That was earlier when the person was working remotely and didn't have a connection to the server.
Oh, right. Cool. Thanks for that too. And by the way, hi, Jack. Thanks for coming. Okay, so I'm going to pause. Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, so John, suppose you have 217 queries to work with. Do you need 217 pass-through queries, or can you run that with code? They're very simple, just execute statements.
So you're saying that you have that many different stored procedures, or you have one or two?
Well, probably one for one, but do you need to, there's such a thing as clutter and too many objects, and you'd have 217 queries to run off of some button on a form, or several forms, of course, but do you need all individual persisted pass-through queries for each one, or can they be run through VBA code?
You can create pass-through queries on the fly.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
You can also reuse your pass-through query objects in Access and modify them using the query def.
Yeah, that's what I've seen before too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Don, thank you so much.
Cuts the clutter down, and the naming conventions finally get out of control. You have query XYZ1, XYZ2. You ran out of names. I have a lot of queries in my client work. So
you can create queries without a name, which are only for one-time use. So you can do that.
Right, then modify them with code as needed.
Right.
Yeah, I always do it like I do a select in the VBA code, and then I call the stored procedure and say don't use a name for the query and execute it directly. You can do that.
Can that be done with a pass-through query, or just a regular query?
No, I sit it down with a pass-through query. You just actually manually, the exercise I did some time ago, you just manually change one pass-through query as needed.
Yeah. But I don't know that you can not give it a name and do it through code.
Well, that's called, Sproc _test or something.
Right. No, but I think what Klaus was saying is, you can create a query def without a name, execute it, and then it just goes away. I don't think there's any way to say that this is a pass-through query when you do it that way.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I think a pass-through query has to be saved so that it knows it's a pass-through query. Maybe there's a way to do it.
I missed that point. Yep.
I
I don't know any VBA code that would say this query that I'm writing here is a pass-through query.
Got it. And I think where we're going next actually is going to answer some of what you guys are talking about. It's a good segue into the next piece. Okay, so we have one other one we're going to look at, this right here. So I want to show you guys how we pass in parameters to a stored procedure using a pass-through query using some code. So what we did here is a very simple query, basically just getting the list of persons from the AdventureWorks, and we're just going to pass in a first name. Very simple. We're going to run it over here first so we can see that it works. I think actually Ken is in that list. There we go. There's your Ken. And so how do we do this with a pass-through query? And especially since we know that this is a variable and it's going to change. So I'm sure there's a bunch of ways to do this. I've written my own code over the years I've been using for a long time. It works great for me. I did this real quick just to get us up and running. So if I click this button, there's all the errands. If I switch to, let's say we just saw Ken, we can do Ken. There's the Ken. So we're basically just we're behind the scenes. We're just updating that piece right there. Whoops, that piece right there. So I'm gonna show you how I do that in a second. But before I do, I actually wanted to show you one of the reasons I love a pass-through query is that if I want to create a form, for example, off of this guy, which is returning results, I can do that. I can work with this query just like I would work with any internal any internal access query. And I love that. So I could actually write a query on this query. And this is one of the reasons I prefer this over ADO. And there might be a way to do this with ADO that I'm not aware of, but this is way cooler to me to be able to do this and then build a query on this and then be able to almost stack them if I had to. I don't stack them too much, but that works better for me. Go ahead.
And less brain damage.
Yes, I'm pro less brain damage as well. Thank you. And again, right here with this query right here, I can easily just create a simple form. Can I? Oh, it did the thing where it selected the wrong. Let's do that one more time. You get it this time? Hey, welcome home. So this, we just created a form on that. Now I actually have a UI that I can work with this stored procedures there as well. So which is great. So I did think of one other thing that we didn't talk about in a con around stored procedures, which is that, let me remember how this works. If you have a form or report that has a child object, I'm trying to think of which one it is now. The child object you can't use the master child link if you're using stored procedures. And I don't know the reason that is. So what I end up doing there, and again, a little beyond the scope of this, or if I guess maybe a better way of saying is if I thought ahead, I would have put it together, is what I do then in those scenarios, let's say for a report, is I'll actually just create, I'll use temporary tables locally, fill them with, run the stored procedure, fill the local table, and then run the report. And what I find is that I get so much better performance on most of my reports. And then you also, as a result, because your reports are now using local temp tables, you can then use master child link between forms and subforms or reports and subreports. Where with if you called the stored procedure directly, you don't have that option. So, okay, so how do we do this? Thanks for asking. So I have let's just kind of talk through the code here and then we'll get to where we're going to get to. So first thing I'm doing is just closing the query if it's open, because we want to make sure that we see the the changes we made refreshed. And basically creating a variable for the actual pass-through query I'm running. And then I'm actually creating a list of parameters. And there's probably a cleaner way to do this. I've seen it done a couple different ways. But ultimately what I just came up with was delimiting the parameters by a semicolon on either side. And then in front of that semicolon, if it's a string, varchar, whatever you want to call it, or a date, I'm proceeding it with just whatever its delimiter is, which for SQL Server is a apostrophe, single quote. If this was a number, I wouldn't require that. And then I can just basically build this list of this variable out with all of the parameters I'm going to be passing in. So in this case, the first name. And then I have two variables now. One's query, one that's the parameters. And I pass that on to what I call the Sproc handler, which is literally a function. We'll take a look at it in a moment. And in that, what it does is it basically opens up that PST, that pass-through query, finds the parameters in it, removes them, and then replaces them with whatever I just passed in. So in a sense, we're just changing this on the fly. And then finally here, just opening up that query. So that's what we're doing here when we run this code. So if I run it again, as you would expect, if I change it to, let's say, Aaron, and I go back and look behind the scenes, you can see Aaron got changed out. So that's how I use stored procedures in pass-through queries all day long. We can dig into the code on this a little bit more here in a moment, but before I do, I want to pause and see if there's any questions.
The old guy here in Denver is impressed.
Oh, great. I was going to say stunned into silence. Thank you. Cool. So let's look at the code on this. It's so let's see here. I haven't dug into this in a while, so it'll be fun. So basically what we're going to do is we're basically going to pull out the stored procedure from the query def of the SQL. So we're passing in the query name. We're going out and doing that there. Take a look at that. So right here, we're setting a reference to the query def itself for that query. We're pulling out the SQL of that query, so the execute command, as it were. We're doing a trim on it just to be, I don't know, clean. And then what we're looking for is the first space right after the execute, and then using that as our start position. So let's look at it together here. So we're looking for this first space, because I know that once I get to that space, the next space I'm going to hit is going to be the end of my stored procedure name and the beginning of my parameter list. So that's what we're doing here. And then once we have that, we can then basically extract just that, because I know that I'm going to basically rebuild it using that and then adding in the parameters I'm passing in over here afterwards. It's just a lot of string manipulation, as it were. And then I'm passing back just that. So where was I? There we go. So now that I've got them over here, basically what I should be seeing is, you know what? You're thinking it, I'm thinking it too. We should be tracing this code. There we go. So we should see there's their dbo.usp. And we actually pulled out the execute. We could just add that back in later because we know it's always going to be there. And so now what we want to do is basically build out our SQL statement. So passing in both our stored procedure that we've now pulled out of our pass-through query, and then also our parameters. And here we're going to split out our parameters using a array. And we're going to not loop through that because, well, actually, before we do, I'll just jump in and just say, so what it's basically doing is if it knows that the first, because it's going to be alternating between the delimiter, in this case, a single quote because it's a text string, or the second is going to be the actual value. So it's sort of delimiter value. So it needs to know when it's looping through the array, which one it's on. And I think there's a cleaner way to do this with arrays, but this was the best I had when I was working on it, and it works. And I just haven't had the time or desire to make it any fancier. So I'll get out of that loop. And so at this point, we've now passed back the query state, the SQL statement, because we've looped through and kind of put all those pieces together. The execute, which we know is always going to be there, the exec, the space, the stored procedure name itself, and then our list of parameters all put together all nice. And now we're going to go in and go to a very simple procedure that's going to change the SQL statement of the actual query def. Not very fancy, but quite functional. And that's it. And now we're just going to open it. So, and I use this with single parameters. I got some stored procedures that have 7, 10 different parameters. And it works great for all of them. And I find it, even though maybe the code isn't, again, I don't know, maybe there's a cleaner way to do it, but in that case, it's just going to look like, you know, something like this. So I should do that. And just keep going down like that and keep adding in whatever parameters I keep passing in. And I find that when I go back from a maintainability and a management perspective, if I go back to code I wrote a year or 2 years ago, I find that this listed out here is so easy for me to go in if I need to add or change a parameter, because I changed the stored procedures parameters. Like, let's say I added a new one on. This code is so easy for me to maintain. You know, like you copy paste it in. What's the new value coming in, and then I'm off to the races. So this is the call versus the ADO call that we saw earlier for me. I find this much cleaner to work with. And again, what my result is an actual either row. It's always a row set. It's either a row set with actual data for the user for the UI, or it's a row set that has a single row telling me whether I got a return result of yay, it worked, or no, it didn't. And if it didn't work, I can then manage it from there, because all I have to do is a very simple, I didn't put the example in here, but what I can do, if this was, instead of returning row data, something more like this, where it's running an action query and then giving me result, I can run the, where am I at? Sproc handler, and then I can do a, create a dim RS, let's see here. Yeah, RS as DAO record set. And then I can actually do set RS equal to current DB, whoops, record set, and then, wait, I missed a piece. I hear you yelling at me. Stop yelling. Wait, did I do that right? No, actually I don't need the query def. Not in this case. Right there. And then I can just go in and read that one row that returns, right? And then get, for example, what was the name of the field? My return. You know, so I can actually work with the my return now and read that value, and then make logic decisions around what I want to do next. Did it come back good? Did it not? You know, did it come back successful or not? Or for example, let's say that the action query does a bunch of stuff, including creating a new row. And what I want to do is return that new ID that was generated in that row. I can just put that in one of the return fields columns and then read it out here, and then move on with my code from here. This makes me happy. Because that's all that really matters here. As long as Aaron's happy, we're all good. All right. Let me pause here and ask if we have any other questions or comments.
Hey, Aaron, this is Ben. I'd like to say another advantage of using this query def reusable query is that if after you run the code and it fills in the parameters, the query def now has those parameters, and you can go back to that query def and run it again during debug to figure out, well, why was the last call not giving me the data I wanted, or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Ben, thanks for coming, bud. Absolutely. So a lot of times if I'm debugging with a client or even on my own, you know, running this button, hitting this button is going to throw an error. I actually now have my call to then copy this, go straight over to SSMS, pop it in here, run it, and then actually see, oh, I see where it's erroring out because I'm getting an error message over here, and then debug. So it literally just is a much smoother transition into here to figure out what it is. I've already got my call clean. And again, this is such a simple example, but you know, in some of a more complex stored procedure where we may have multiple parameters, it may not be as easy to recreate it to then debug. So yeah, thanks for that, Ben.
Have you ever seen it done that instead of doing it as a primary, you do it as a where clause? So as you can actually see what it is you're setting to what, in case you got them out of order or something.
You said a where clause. Are you actually mean a where clause, or do you mean oh my God, I'm forgetting the term,
Is-
where the parameter has the actual name of the name parameters.
Name parameters.
You know, I've thought about doing that. That's become more of the standard, or maybe it's always been the standard. I'm just getting caught up, but I've never actually updated the code to work that way. I'm sure that could work. Because you're right, it's a lot cleaner, especially when you start going into passing in, you know, like codes or IDs, then it becomes even harder to figure out what it is. That's a good idea,
Because like I
Jack.
say, you just get them out of order and the whole thing blows up on you. And you're going, well, what the hell's wrong with it?
Totally. So you get the benefit of it being in any order you want, for that matter. And also it's just more readable. It's more text, obviously, but that would be an interesting take, an interesting way of doing it. I'm wondering how that works. I guess you don't need to declare a parameter because it's already a parameter, right? In here, so it would be
Right, it's just another string that you're sending over.
right. I think its first name is the name of that parameter, right? Let's just double check.
Ken? Isn't that the way they do it at your organization?
Yeah, pretty much, yes. And I'm very impressed, Dawn, that you remembered that.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, that's
very.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, that would be a nice little addition to this code, would be to actually have it do that. My gut tells me it's a little more development time, because then I've got to start managing those, but it's actually long-term more manageable. So I could actually see the value in it. So then what we would end up having would be the parameter lists that we generate right here.
Yes,
would
right.
go from being 2 to 3 pieces, right? So this would be, and again, the code's not built to handle this at all, but conceptually what we would be looking at would be that. So you'd be passing in the name parameter, the delimiter, and then the value. And what would be really cool would be, I don't know if you could do this or not, I'm just thinking out loud, is if you could have it figure out on the fly without having to tell it whether it needs a delimiter or not. I don't know how to do that, but that's okay. We're not going to go there. Yeah, that's a great idea, though. Thank you guys for that thought. I'll ponder that.
The big reason is when you're taking over someone else's code that's been modified by many people over years, it gets to really be bad when you end up finding something that's got 15 parameters.
Totally.
It is a little bit more arcane though. So there's, if whoever's taking over the code isn't familiar with that, there's a bit of a learning curve.
Yeah. And if I can heckle the crowd, it's not my problem. You're taking over my work.
That was my thought too, Aaron.
I just need to change my name to there and no one will know it was me.
I'm thinking more of you. I'm thinking more of you having dropped dead by getting hit by a bus and someone now has to pick up after you.
Totally. Again, not my problem. But yeah, no, I get you. I get what you mean. It is better code. All joking aside, it is better code. And very honestly, and I have actual projects and some pretty complicated stored procedures where when I'm debugging over here in this, I'm cursing myself going, what does the one mean? Which parameter is that? And I have to go back over to SQL Server and then sort of navigate that stuff. So yeah, I'm driving myself nuts a little bit in here. And so I can see the value in that as well. And the other piece that is to have to remember that if this changes here, you have to make the change in both places, which again, isn't that big of a deal, but just have to keep track of that. And if it doesn't, well, you'll find out, I think you'll find out the hard way pretty fast, because if I do that, I think we can assume that's not going to work. Yeah, there we go. Cool. Let's see here. Before I jump into here real quick, George, can you give me a quick time check? I've kind of lost track. We got I think we got 30 minutes.
Yes, you have 34 minutes actually. So
great. So I'm just going to speak really, really slowly. So I'm going to show one last little thing here. Ben's already like clapping. Let's see, where's my browser?
I thought I was muted.
Yeah. So this is a slightly off topic, but not super off topic. For projects where you're actually converting code over from, more specifically, converting SQL statements over to T-SQL. Ben and Juan Soto at accessusergroups.org. I thought he was a different company name, but whatever, created this tool online. So I'm going to give it a quick shout out. It's pretty cool. I'll shout out to myself as well, that I'm right there. That this was a project I originally built on my own, came up with a little utility internally as a Access add-in, shared it with Ben. Ben did some really great stuff with it, and then carried it over to, is it IT Impact? Is that their actual name? I think that's Juan's company.
Yes, IT Impact, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And so they put this up as a free tool. I want to push it out. I think it's really cool what they did here, and we're working with 2017. I don't have any fancy code or anything to work with that's going to look impressive here. So I'm just going to say this is a great tool. I'm going to pop this into the chat in case anyone wants to noodle around on it. And if you really want to make Ben happy, click this guy right over here. I was going to leave you a little one, but I realized I was just going to say hi, but then I realized I'll probably get in trouble for that. Anyway, so I feel like it kind of goes a little bit in line with what we're doing here, because if you're deciding, hey, I want to move some of my slower or less performant access queries over to stored procedures, this tool actually can help you do that. Helps you get a little bit through the learning curve of knowing the syntax changes and all that stuff. So, yeah. So, like I said, I wanted to leave a lot of open space in this to have some. So we got about almost 30 minutes here. And I'm kind of done with what I had to share, but I'm really open to thoughts, ideas around stored procedures. We can dig into a little bit more over here if we want as well.
And if you have questions about the SQL converter, I can help you out.
There are a couple of questions in chat, Aaron. I'd be happy to read them out for you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you, George.
Phil asked about optional parameters, if you covered that, and if you did, would you go back to that again real quickly if you have a chance?
Yeah, I didn't cover it. As far as calling them, making the call from, let's say, using the pass-through query, because it's optional, you can just choose to leave it out or not. I don't use optional parameters much. If I do, I tend to use, I'll tend to use like a default value. I'm getting my syntax wrong here. There we go. Of like that instead. That isn't right. Why is that? I thought it was just an equals. There we go. But yeah, using, from the standpoint of using it here, from the stored procedure side of it, from the SQL side of it, it's, you can either pass in an optional value or not. And then from the calling it side, you can just choose to leave it or not, leave it in or take it out. I prefer to have a value for all of my parameters. It always feels cleaner to me and more consistent with the calls, but that might be more of a preference.
Well, too, and if you have multiple optional parameters, it seems like you can't leave one out of the middle. You have to put a null there.
Right. And I think there's a shorthand, I think, as well when calling it, where I think you can do, I've never done this, but I think you can just pop that in as the placeholder. And I believe that will just say, hey, whatever the default value is, use it. So you don't have to throw a null, which would throw it off, and you get that option too. So the other thing that's kind of great about this is that you can have, let's see, let's just do an ID and call it an int, which would be, you know, an int would be analogous to a long in access. The nice thing about this can be null. And as you probably know in VBA land, a long variable, a long integer variable cannot be null. It has to have a value, which usually defaults to 0. And I really enjoy having a variable, a number variable being null. It feels cleaner. I can flash back to having a long discussion with a bunch of database nerds in like the early 2000s at a conference talking about, is 0 or null the same, or can you be treated as the same? And I can hear all you guys getting stirred up and lighting your torches to go storm the castle, and I don't blame you, but man, a null value here versus having to force a value, and it's so nice, so much cleaner for writing code.
Yes.
And if you feel differently, bring it on. Let's do this. Throw down right here. Yeah, that's my take. So that's another reason I do enjoy using stored procedure. It's a little off topic, and actually, let me loop back around. I think Phil asked about optional parameters. Did that at all touch on what you wanted to know?
Phil, come on, Phil.
Yeah. Yeah, it did.
Okay.
Aaron, the last name with the default, if that were optional, wouldn't it need to be nvarchar 50 null?
Good point, actually. I think, wait. And see, here's the thing is I don't even use it that option. I think it's.
I don't think optional is a keyword.
You're right.
I think you have to, it has to be null and then equals Kogan.
Like that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Someone slap me if I'm wrong.
Looks good.
All right, thank you. Yeah, again, I don't use them much, so it doesn't, I'm not familiar with the syntax very well. And what it's nice about them too is, again, I believe they default to null anyways, which is nice versus, again, I know I'm comparing VBA to this, but in a way, you know, stored procedures, T-SQL is, if you want to go there, a blend of VBA and SQL and Access. It's not exactly true, but conceptually you have code mixed in with query language and SQL language, and there's certain things I like better here than I do with VBA, and one of those being with an optional in VBA. I always feel like I'm relearning it every time, and maybe I'm tipping my hand too much and showing how incompetent I am, but when I'm running a VBA function and I have to handle whether it has an optional value or not, and I haven't given it a default, the is missing thing sometimes trips me up. I don't always feel like it's clean, and it's sort of frustrating. So again, optional ones I try to avoid, or I always give them default values. So at least I know that if it's coming in and not been passed, I know I can expect you know, maybe an empty string or a zero length string or something to that effect. But yeah, any other thoughts, questions, concerns, heckles?
Back when you were discussing the use of ADO versus pass-throughs, D. Hookham wrote, I keep one PT and then change the SQL property. I think that's probably analogous to what you were doing.
Keep one, you said PT?
Yeah, one, I assume that's pass-through.
Oh, got it. And then so just basically having one pass-through and then always updating the T-SQL of it or the SQL statement of it and then firing that off. Is that what I think that's what I'm hearing?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
I might have more than one, but typically I have one, and it might call the same pass through, but I'll put different parameters or with it. So, but and then you can have a subform that is basically the source of that is like query dot and then my pass through. So I can have a subform with and it'll return different columns, different whatever, but works really pretty well.
So in a sense, you're actually using the subform, quote unquote, is actually the object is actually the query itself,
Yes.
not an actual sort of.
It's not really a subform. It's you know, it's a query dot and then the query name.
Right. I haven't done that in a long time. I've done that in past projects a long time ago, but that is really cool because you end up getting in a very dynamic way, you end up getting this changing structural data section. That's really cool.
Yeah, and you know, I have a whole kind of a query by form that basically has a multiple queries, and you can create a continuous form that uses a drop down with the type. Instead of being like a value list or whatever, you can have it as a field list. So that field list, then you can say, okay, I want to go to this query or this table and pull in the field, so they can then select, as many fields as they want, and then you can use a pass through from that and have a subform that is a query dot whatever, query dot my query name, and it'll display the results without having to, have multiple text boxes that you're setting the control source of them or whatever. You don't have to iterate through anything. It ends up being real slick.
That's really cool. Yeah, very dynamic.
Oh yeah.
Instead of having to create controls and setup for every instance of it, you just have it. Yeah,
so cool. You're dealing with about a couple lines of code versus iterating through a record set and finding the fields collection. That's like, don't do it.
Yeah, trippy. I had an interesting idea. You just sparked my memory about something. So Don, early on, you had said, one of the cons of using a stored procedure is that it's read only, and that is very true.
Yeah.
But I did a little hacky thing recently that actually worked out pretty cool. And it's not for every scenario, but what I do is, again, I'm not presenting it here, but I do a lot of temp tables, local temp tables and access, where I'll run the stored procedure, use an append query, and then fill the temp table and then display that to the user. Now, granted, that's technically editable in that it's a local temp table, but as you already know, it's not saving it to the permanent data set. So it's like, okay, what are you going to do? So I've had some scenarios where I did the heavy lifting of saying if they change it in that temp table, then wrote some code to then have it capture those changes and then save it back to the permanent data set. I don't do it a lot. There's a couple scenarios where I needed that. But what I'm getting to is I did this interesting thing where I thought, what happens if I run the stored procedure and just return the ID of all the data I want to display, and then link that temp table with the IDs to the live linked tables and then display that? So what I end up doing is using the stored procedure to do the heavy lifting on the query to give me the list of results I want. But then since that's linked to the live table, I can then make that live table editable in the interface. I don't know if that even made sense out loud. It's probably better shown than told, but that's something I did recently and I was like, ooh, this is kind of cool.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Good. That means I explained it well. That's cool. I just popped open the chat here. George, are there any other ones I missed? I just saw that.
Yeah, the last one from Jim, if you want to address that one.
So regarding form subform link not working, is that true if the parent field is bound to a text box and the text box is referenced in the link master fields? Next question. I don't know. Let me think about this. If the parent field is bound to a text box and the text box is referenced in the, I don't know. We'd have to test that out.
Yeah, I don't know if everyone knows, but there are two ways you can do the link there. You can just reference the field in the parent in the link master fields, or you can bind that field to like a text box and reference the text box in the link master fields, which is actually the preferred way to do it. So now you've got me wondering, and I'm going to go and try it tomorrow. I'll let you know, Aaron.
For sure. If I had to put a little money in it, I'd say it wouldn't work, because I believe Access, as soon as it sees a subform with the link, the master child link values in there, and a stored procedure as the subform stored procedure, I think it complains as soon as it sees that, to be honest. But yeah, I'd be interested to see what happens. But you bring up a really cool point, which is a little off topic, but actually really cool. I've done this in some projects where instead of linking the subform to the parent record, which is what we all do commonly, is I actually created a list box with, and I can't think of a project to bring up quick enough to do anything with it, but I had a list box on the side here. So let's do this real fast. And now we switch into UI. Is this list box? There we go. I'm still getting used to this new layout and new format. I'm still hovering over and going, is that a button or is that a box? So right here would be, let's say, a list of a bunch of values or IDs. We'd probably display something other than that, but let's just put IDs in here like that. But the display value would be something like a name or whatever. And then we would have a subform over here. Boop, 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 boop. Is that a subform? Okay. And if you, yeah, I recognize that. So if you actually had this, like Jim was saying, linked not to the record, but to the list box itself, as you click different items in the list box, yeah, I hear you. It's supposed to be value. This will automatically update to show you that. I always thought that was a really cool feature. I don't use it as much as I might, could, or should, or want to, but that's a pretty cool thing. So I guess just to round it out, as long as we're here, is that right here, this would be, whatever is it, list 6 is the name of that. So this would be list 6. Is that gonna work? Something like that. And then over here would be the ID, obviously the ID column in the subform. We're hacking this together, so we're not going deep into it, but something to play around with if you ever have a need for this to be not linked to any master data, but actually just to this interface here. I think it's a really clean way of doing stuff.
And in design view of that, okay, if you go select the subform and then the source object, you can, there's where you can probably put in like query dot query underscore sproc underscore pst or ps, yeah. So you can, so it's not really you got to put query dot.
Oh, right. Thank you.
Yeah. And then boom, it worked. So you know, you can see that you don't really need a subform object in there, but you know, you don't have a link master child unless you have a value returned of our column with 1, 2, or 4 in it.
Right.
But that just gets back to just saying, okay, you know, here's you know what I typically use to display kind of really dynamic queries that can return any number of columns, any number of records, you know, whatever you want. It's really pretty quick way of displaying those on a subform.
For sure, and it seems like the only drawback is you don't have the flexibility of the VBA behind the form controls and all that. But
exactly, but
if you're
all
just
you're doing is read only, you know, records. You know, it works out really well.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I forgot, you said it earlier, they're using stored procedures in here or just standard queries?
Or either or, yeah, definitely.
It doesn't really matter, actually.
It's just part of a query by form that I had done many years ago, and then you know, spent a lot of time writing code to iterate through the columns and the fields and setting control sources of controls, and it's like, oh, I can replace all of that code with one line that sets the source object to query dot and then a query name.
That's really cool. What's interesting too is that I know that technically there's no valid data link between, or value link between these two, but it didn't complain, oh, I didn't put the child in.
You didn't put a child in there, so.
That's why.
You just use your My table right now for that instead of, it wouldn't be a Sproc, but it would be linked,
Right.
wouldn't it?
We could try it out. Can you do
You could do probably a table.mytable.
Let's try it out. Okay, so far no complaints.
There.
And then let's actually link it.
There.
Oh, look at that.
Nice, huh?
Yeah.